For me, artistic production, creative work is part of the activity of society. It's part of how people talk to one another. I think if we're talking to one another, then there are important things to talk about. These are literally questions of life and death and how we want to shape our world and what we want the future to be like. So these are important things. And I think music can be a space where we look at these things, much as painting or literature or movies can be. For me, it's in a way obvious that, my work should embrace these things and look at the questions. In a way, that's part of why I was sort of so interested in punk when I was a kid, because punk had a sort of iconoclastic stance, against the society of the time, and in the UK there was this sort of right-wing consensus around Margaret Thatcher, which obviously was toxic for culture and society generally. I mean, looking back at an old piece, whether it's performing it in a concert or making a new recording of it, this is like meeting an earlier version of yourself. So it's a bit weird as an experience, and can be quite surprising because, time goes by and you are different, but the music is the music, the score is the score. So it's interesting to see how the decisions I made at that time about how to handle the material. Sort of compare that to my thinking now, it's quite different in a way. But it was nevertheless wonderful to be able to re-experience that sort of compositional process, but through a different lens, which is the orchestra. We had this opportunity to work with Kristjan Järvi and his orchestra, the Baltic Sea Phil, which is an orchestra a little bit like the East-West Divan of Barenboim. It's a sort of peacemaking orchestra, founded of young players from all around the Baltic. So including old East Bloc, old West Bloc, so-called sort of territories, countries, and using music as a bridge, as a common space, shared experience, shared creative endeavor, which in my view is an elevating activity. It makes the world a tiny bit better, tiny bit. I was very excited to work with those guys. Exiles is a piece which has a social commentary aspect to it. It was originally conceived during the time of the so-called migrant crisis from the Syrian conflict, this great number of people having to leave that whole region and being displaced, and the struggles of various European nations, how to deal with that. And it was a very hot topic, a very hot question, with a lot of conflicting opinions. And I wanted to make a piece which allowed us to kind of think about that and to reflect on it. And the music actually sort of embodies this idea of a journey. So that was, the centerpiece of the recording idea. And this orchestra with its peacemaking function really fit together really well with that. I personally don't like the idea of categories, and I don't really think human beings naturally work that way. I don't think our affection and our love comes in packages and boxes. I think we just follow the things we love and we find attractive, and that's where we go. And I feel like that with music. It's true, I have a formal classical composer background, but I've always been, much wider than that, and I think it's quite natural to be wider than that. I think a lot of these things are driven by marketing categories, and actually one of the things that streaming has done is it's actually opened up those boxes, because there's no risk anymore. People can just sort of listen to whatever they want, and so I think that's one of the sort of side effects of streaming. I mean, I guess the biggest example of that is the use of On the Nature of Daylight in Shutter Island, the Martin Scorsese film. This was interesting because the music appears a few times in the film, and then it appears in the end title, which is in a kind of a mashup with a Dinah Washington track, This Bitter Earth. I was really doubtful about that idea. I mean, obviously Scorsese's a great filmmaker, and the fact that Robbie Robertson was his kind of music guy, and I'm a sort of huge Dylan fan, and for me it was like, the whole project was just, this is an amazing thing. So I was really excited and really happy about that. But the idea of sort of mashing the piece up with Dinah Washington on paper, you know, when they told me about that, I was like, I don't think that's a very good idea at all. I'm not sure about this. But then when I heard it, I thought it was utterly beautiful, and it had been done so tastefully and so, with, you know, it was so clever the way they'd pulled these two worlds together. I just thought it was stunning. Yeah, it made me see the music in a different way, which I thought was really, yeah, it was great.
The glow of a rose.
Even though he was, you know, proper modernist, his music is not like, you know, Boulez's music is in a way about erasing the past, right? It's really antagonistic to the past. Berio's music is the opposite. It really embraces, you know, it embraces Schubert, embraces the Beatles, embraces folk song, medieval music, you know, everything. I mean, a piece like Symphonia is like, just let's take it all, you know, we'll take it all forward. And he makes this new language out of it. So I love the generosity of that, and I love the playfulness of it. And he was just brilliant with me, you know. I mean, he just kind of suggested that instead of like filling all the pages with millions of notes, I should just really focus on the essentials and what I was trying to do, really. And because he was so brilliant, I listened to him, because I was quite an unteachable person as a kid. You know, I've kind of felt you know, at some level I was like, I knew everything already. So I was probably really annoying to all my professors in university and the academy. But because he was Berio and he said it, then I listened. It's always been a kind of a voyage of discovery, really. You know, I mean, I had this sort of classical background, if you like, you know, university, conservatoire, all of that, and then the studies with Berio. But at the same time, I was always interested in, you know, what was coming from the kind of popular music side, the experimental rock music, electronic music, you know, all of those things were always interesting to me. I had been trained within modernism, you know. So basically, at that time, you know, complicated music was good music. And if simple music was just dumb or bad music, and you shouldn't write it, you know. And so, like, my professors, you know, used to just think, you know, Philip Glass, Steve Reich and Ivo Peck were kind of a bad joke, you know. That was the attitude. So, however, I felt that, you know, these guys and the other people like Andreessen and people working more within simpler forms, broadly tonal music, I felt like actually that was more authentically human than modernism. You know, modernism was very abstract, very, if you like, alienated, very kind of Freudian, very sort of 20th century hang-ups. And actually there was something deeper going on. And that connects into rhythm, in the case of Reich and Glass, I guess. And then melody. And then Arvo Pärt and these kinds of people, Gavin Bryars and Meredith Monk, and, you know, so there's something deeper and more fundamentally human in this simpler language. So I decided that I was going to just take away all of this complication from my language and try and discover something very direct and personal and authentic. And so that really has been my journey, from this sort of high modernist, super complicated, you know, just millions of notes on a page, to something very direct and straightforward.